Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Video Clips. And just a couple of announcements. It's still career training time because some classes are starting later this week and some are starting next week. So you can still get in. I mean, I don't like the last minute, but we're pretty good at it after all these years. So if you're still thinking you want to do something with us, Pam Popper at msn.com is the place to the best email, and I'll get with you and figure out what's right for you. Remember that we have a nutrition educator program, which is an alternative to dietetics, and I'm teaching a really interesting class that I really enjoy teaching and do every couple of years or so. It's called Nutritional Issues and Controversies, and it gets into all of the government subsidies and our food policies in this country and food policies in other countries and global food production, a lot of stuff that I think you guys are pretty interested in. So, and you can take that class even if you're not enrolled in the entire diploma program. And then we have many other things, professional mentoring and clinical skills, the diet and lifestyle intervention program, which is a 15-week series that is an overview of informed decision-making and diet lifestyle change as it pertains to so many different diseases: men's health, women's health, children's health, cancer, autoimmune disease, gastrointestinal disease, heart disease, diabetes, etc., Alzheimer's disease. So it's an overview course that covers a lot of ground. So anyway, if you're interested in that, send me an email at pampopper@msn.com, and you can take isolated courses without taking entire programs here. And some people will do that just to check us out a little bit and try it before they commit to something bigger and more expensive and that sort of thing. So we welcome that. And then remember, I'm doing this research and writing boot camp in February. It's a 2.5-hour version of an 8-month course that I teach that involves a lot of paper writing, and it's very expensive because of the paper writing and how much time it takes me to grade the stuff. But this is a condensed version that happens in an afternoon, and you don't have to do any homework assignments. You may choose to, but no homework assignments that have to be completed. So a lot of people are interested in that as well. And then last but not least, our Make Americans Free Again calls are Thursday at noon, where I tell you how to mobilize and organize in your state. And Make Americans Free Again, Ohio Stands Up joint meetings are at my office on Thursday night. So you can find out about all that too. So let's get into today's topic. I want to talk about kids in schools. There's no question that this debacle is hurting people, but there's no question also that it's disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable people in our society, and those happen to include children. The school policies are just draconian and ridiculous, and they're not justified based on any known science, and people are starting to speak up about it. So here in Ohio, and I think it's pretty typical of what's going on everywhere, reopening plans included this constant testing. And then also, if a student was exposed to COVID, then the child had to be quarantined for 14 days. And it's incredibly disruptive. I know people here in Ohio who've had this happen, and having your kid home for 14 days and they can't go to school. And it's just a mess, right? So Jonathan Cooper is the superintendent of Mason City Schools here in Ohio, and he started questioning the policy when he was actually involved in writing policies for his school system. And then he started questioning it when a star football player was sidelined from a playoff game. The student's name was Brady Camello, and he had been seated in class and masked and near another student who later tested positive. And of course, this kid was hoping for a football scholarship. I mean, we're ruining the lives of kids. We're going to be paying for this for decades, right? And he said, "I'm so upset right now that I have to miss my first playoff game and possibly my last high school game ever." And he pleaded, this was an email he sent to the superintendent, and pleaded for the superintendent to give an exception to the rules. So the superintendent, apparently not knowing what a swine we have running the little emperor who runs our state here, sends the email to our Emperor DeWine asking for an exception. Of course, it wasn't granted. So this is a guy who would not allow two parents to be in the room at the same time with their dying child, 7-year-old child with a brain tumor last spring. So I don't think it's any surprise that he really didn't care about this kid's life and his football scholarship or anything else. Why would, if you're not concerned about dying children being with their parents, I don't think that football is going to bother you all that much. So of course he said no. And Mr. Cooper came back and said, we're over quarantining kids like crazy and it's creating big stressors on the whole system. What we'd love is for our policymakers to look at policymakers, I slipped there, to be looking at everything we've learned since last spring and rethink things so that we could use data to maybe change the situation. So the bottom line is that this creates a huge amount of instability in kids' lives, not to mention the devastating effect it can have on a young man who thinks he's going to maybe go to college on a football scholarship and play professional football. And by the way, don't overestimate the importance of this. One of a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine here in Ohio, her son got a football scholarship to Ohio State, and he ended up getting signed with a professional football team for millions of dollars in upfront fees. And so here's a family that went from poverty to millionaire status in a couple generations because of that. Great kid. I've met this, well, he's not a kid anymore. He's a very rich, successful young man, but I remember meeting him when he was a senior in high school and thinking, what a great man with a promising future. Well, we're taking that all away from kids right now, and I think it's pretty abominable. So anyway, Brown University economist Emily Oster, who's studied this issue, school closures and quarantines and policies and that sort of thing, has basically said administrators overreacted. And so she formed a group that tracked over 9,000 schools and 4 million students who were able to go to school for some form of in-person learning. And she found that the group found that the biweekly infection rate was 0.22% for students and 0.42% among staff. Now, to put this in terms that would mean something to you, 1.1 children and 2.1 staffers per each 1,000 people per week. So nationwide, this means that students who attend school are infected at a rate that's 27% lower than the case of communities they live in. And remember, infection doesn't mean you're sick. Infection just means you've been around somebody, and they're assuming that that you are sick. So she says they can quarantine 500 people, and that's really costly on a lot of levels, and 0 of them end up having COVID. And she is strongly encouraging schools to reconsider their policies at this point in time. Now, the Centers for Disease Control, of course, by the time you watch this, they'll probably change their mind again because they change their mind on everything from week to week. But they basically have said 7 and 10-day quarantines are fine. And of course, the issue is why quarantine? You know, kids, it's flu season, it's cold season, kids get sick every year, it happens. This is just ridiculous. But anyway, they've changed. And in response, Ohio has reduced its quarantine down to 10 days. And then other research groups have said, you know, it's not just 1 or 2. Lots of research groups have said kids and schools are not the place where transmission is huge. And the other thing I think is important to keep in mind is that the average age of teachers is like 40. So we don't have people who are 75 years old, for the most part, teaching in high schools where they might be considered part of that vulnerable population. That's just not the case. So some schools are getting very aggressive about all this nonsense. In late November, the Woodward, Oklahoma school board voted to end a quarantine requirement for students potentially exposed to a positive case, arguing that it just kept kids out of school for too long. Now, the state of Oklahoma stepped in and wouldn't let them do that, but the school board, which is close to the people who are being affected, local government is something I'm a big fan of, because we have to imagine, I don't think takes a big intellectual jump to imagine that local people know more about what's going on locally than people who are in state government or federal government. But anyway, the state reversed the decision. And Colorado unveiled a detailed plan that de-emphasized quarantines and instead doing some detailed contact tracing and all that sort of thing. But the bottom line is that all of this, if you take a look, there's a huge disconnect between what the federal government and the state governments are saying and then what the local school systems are saying based on the experience that they're having with families and with schools. And so anyway, even the Mason Education Association the union local representing the district's teachers says that there's nothing the matter with this Superintendent Cooper's idea that we need to rethink this. They also are seeing the difficulty. And by the way, you know, I know I'm critical of teachers. I think we have a lot of bad ones teaching school, but I also know a lot of really fine teachers. And I've had so many of them say to me that the quarantines are disruptive to the classroom. And this business of this remote teaching, I had a teacher just a couple of weeks ago say, I did not go to school to learn how to be a teacher, to be talking to kids through the internet. And another teacher said, I've just, because the kids don't pay attention and they don't stay engaged in the whole 9 yards, she said, to keep them from just going and doing something else, which is running rampant, I'm really favoring entertaining them over teaching them, just to have contact with them, because if I don't entertain them, I don't get an opportunity to do anything at all. So the kids are sliding backwards academically over all of this too. So anyway, you know, if you take a look at all of this, Mason City Schools, it's outside Cincinnati, to give you some perspective. It's an upper middle class suburban district. And over the summer, the Warren County Health Department took guidelines that were established by the American Academy of Pediatrics, that great organization that whose members, that takes huge amounts of money from vaccine makers. In fact, their home office was built by the vaccine makers, mostly by money from the vaccine makers. So definitely want to contact them over school policy. So the idea was the APA said you could seat the kids 3 feet apart if they wore masks, and then the CDC said it had to be 6 feet. Well, they don't have enough buildings to do that. So they decided to seat them closer. And the parents were given a choice between closer seating and, you know, against what the feds had suggested, or remote learning, and 80% of the high school students came back to school. Parents understand kids need to be in school. So in more than 4 months of in-person learning, 203 students out of 10,500 tested positive. And testing positive doesn't mean anything. If I test positive, I'm a case of what? I'm a healthy person who don't take any medications at all. I'm normal weight. A case of what? So you've got 203 students and 82 staff who have, and then 2,500 kids, students have been quarantined. 2,500 have been quarantined over 203 positive tests, which were not even necessarily people who had symptoms or sickness, okay? It's crazy, all right? And only 4 of them were actually exposed in class. The rest of them were exposed someplace else. So anyway, some parents weighing in here. Every day you walk in and you don't know which class is going to be decimated next, said Mindy Patton, a nonprofit executive whose daughter's Claire, a flutist in the marching band, is a Mason High junior. Claire sat for much of October at a hallway desk or stood in the corner near windows in class, the school's tactic to help avoid exposure that could keep her from a marching band symposium. It worked, and she performed in the concert in a mostly empty football stadium. Claire said students have gotten used to the telltale signs of a staffer entering the classroom and pointing out students that to be led away to quarantine. My least favorite thing about going to school, she said, is I don't know when the Grim Reaper is going to come. This is a really great environment for high school students. You can see the wisdom in this. Barb Shuba, a Mason High chemistry teacher, says, I wish we could do away with the quarantine altogether. Instead of this policy of absolute fear, just use common sense. If your kid isn't feeling well, they should stay home. We should also maintain social distancing. I'm not even in favor of that. That's absolute nonsense. We haven't social distanced during any other flu season, and I don't think that humanity has suffered as a result of that. So the bottom line is it's just, I don't know how thinking people can continue to support this. And the only way that the sheep can support it is that they're not thinking people. In other words, they're believing what they're hearing. They're not taking any time to look at the impact. I'm interested, if you're a sheep and you're watching this, I want you to please write to me at pampopper@onsn.com and tell me how you justify what I just read to you. That we're testing people who have no symptoms, we're keeping kids out of school who have no symptoms, and kids they come in contact with who have no symptoms. We're ruining kids' lives. A high school student saying, we know we've learned what's going on when the Grim Reaper comes into the room to start singling out kids, and you've got a student sitting in the hallway and by open windows in the middle of the winter time so she can play in the marching band in an empty stadium. That seems okay to you, really? I don't think it would be okay to anybody if they just took the time to check into it a little bit. How about that for a unique approach to this? Get some facts before you start spouting your mouth off about some of this stuff. But anyway, that's what's going on in schools. And I do think that the local pressure, if applied enough, will make a difference. So if you have kids in school, the local pressure can build up into pressure in the state government as well. Not as effective as lawsuits, I might add, but at least it's letting people know what you think about it. And I think we need to do a whole lot more of that. All right, that's all for today. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy learning more about this issue from a little bit different perspective, and I'll be back to you tomorrow with more news.